Shalom Aleichem. Hanukkah Sameach, or Smecha, I'm not quite sure. Many years ago, a certain very intense Haredi Bachur Yeshiva said to me that Hallel is only recited for a Nes Al Tiv'i, for a supernatural miracle. Why was he saying this to me? Anyone want to guess?
Talking about Yom Ha'atzmaut.
Exactly. He was explaining to me why it's incorrect to say Hallel Hey B'Iyar, or Yom Tekumas Yisrael, or Yom Ha'atzmaut, etc. What was his proof? So we'll begin actually at the bottom of page 3. You have 4 pages, or 2 pages printed on both sides. The Lashon of the Talmud Bavli Masechet Shabbat Daf Kaf Aleph. This was the proof. My Hanukkah. The Gemara asks a question. The Talmud asks the question, my Hanukkah. The question is, what is the question? we are Jewish after all, so we have to ask about the question itself. What is the question? We'll discuss that in a moment. But let's assume for a moment that the question is, why do we have Hanukkah? That's at least how most people understand the question. And it could be that Rashi understood it that way, which we'll discuss in a moment. So it says as follows: Dithno Rabbanan, Chachamim taught as follows. The Hamisha wa Esrim b'Chislev, on the 25th of Kislev, begins the 8 days of Hanukkah. It says, Yomei de Hanukkah timanaya inon, the 8 days of Hanukkah. Dela mispad bahon, or dela lehita'anot bahon, or lehita'naya bahon, probably it should say. You will note that these words are in Aramaic, correct? The next words from here onwards are in Lashon HaKodesh. Sheker shenichnesu yevanim lehechal timeu kol hashemanim shebaichal. So first of all, this is strange. A baraita normally is all in Hebrew, all Lashon HaKodesh. Why do we have a baraita that begins in Aramaic and then switches to Lashon HaKodesh? The answer is actually very simple, because the first few words, which are in Aramaic, are a direct quote from the Ghilat Ta'anith. The Ghilat Ta'anith is an ancient text from the Zman, mit Kufat Beit Sheni, from the period of the Mikdash, when the Mikdash still stood. So it's over 2,000 years old, maybe even 2,100 or something like that years old. It's essentially a list of days that the Jews, that our forefathers, Eretz Yisrael, B'zman Beit Sheni, used to celebrate in some fashion, to a greater or lesser extent. So, and it's written Aramaic, because it was supposed to be a common text, a handbook for all people, who most people spoke on a daily basis Aramaic. So it says, on the 25th of Kislev begin the 8 days of Hanukkah, when Delala Mispad Behon, when we do not, some people usually translate it as Hespedim, but it's not really talking about Hespedim, it's talking about what we call Nefilat HaPayim, Tahanun. So here we have a source not to say Tahanun for 8 days. It should be Delala Hitanaya Behon, not to fast. You're not allowed to fast on these days of Hanukkah, because they are special days where we have to thank Hashem, and celebratory days. And then it goes on to say B'Lashon HaKodesh, which is now an addition, a kind of perush or tosefet or harhava, an expansion of what Megillat Ta'anith states in Aramaic. Now it says in Hebrew, when the Greco-Assyrians entered the Mikdash, Timau kol hashemanim, they defiled all the shemanim, Right, everything in the Mikdash has to be tahor, including the oil for the menorah. And everything was made tameh by them. And when the Hashmonaim and their followers were victorious and drove them out of the Mikdash and out of Yerushalayim, but the they found only one container of oil that was sealed with the seal of the Kohen HaGadol, which is itself a strange statement, because we're not aware that there was any need for a Kohen Gadol to place a seal on a container of shemen. It's a strange, and I'm not the first person to point this out. And the amount in that container was sufficient for one day for the menorah. Na'asa bo nes, here it says explicitly, take note, Na'asa bo nes, a miracle occurred, a supernatural miracle, that which should have lasted one day, lasted 8 days. V'idliku mimenu shemona yamim. L'shana heret kiv'um v'asa'um yamim tovim b'halel v'hoda'ah. And therefore these days, or the following year, which is also a question, why the following year? That's not such a big zorok kusha kazog dora. L'shana heret kiv'um v'asa'um yamim tovim b'halel v'hoda'ah. So these 8 days you're required to say halel and ala nisim in Birkat HaMazon, in Tfilah. Alright, so that's what the Talmud states. And this Haredi young gentleman, his proof was that, you see, because of the ness of the Pach HaShemen that it mentions, it says, therefore they established these 8 days of Hanukkah, saying Halel, etc., etc. So therefore, Halel can only be said for a ness al-Tivri. Not to put too fine a point on it, that is total nonsense. Completely 100% wrong. How do we know that it is wrong? First of all, we can quote from another Gemara on page 3 from Talmud Bavli, Arachin, Daf Yod, where the Talmud is discussing in detail everything to do with or many things to do with Halel and with Musaf, and when we say Halel Shalem, etc. So it says as follows, number 4. Mai Shana Bahar on Sukkot, Da'amren an Kol Yoma. Why do we say Halel Shalem for 8 days, every day of Sukkot? Umay Shana B'Pesach, Da'amren an Kol Yoma. We only say, Mitzad Hadin, we're only required to say Halel on the first day of Pesach, because the rest of the days we say Minhag B'Tor, we say Halel B'Tor Minhag, and therefore we don't say Halel Shalem. And according to the Rambam, you don't even say a bracha on such Halel, but Rambam is essentially a Dat Yahid, at least B'Tzibur is a Dat Yahid B'Inyan Hazeh. The Geonim were not of that opinion. So why is there this difference between Sukkot and Pesach? The Talmud goes on, Dahal halukim b'korbanothem. The Pesach and halukim b'korbanothem. On Sukkot, every day has a korban musaf, which is different from the day before. So each korban Pesach, every korban musaf on Sukkot is a special event, and Musaf and Halel and Musaf go together, usually, very often. So when there is a special korban on that day, there is Halel. Whereas on Pesach, for the 7 days, we bring the same korban musaf. So it's not new. The second day, the third day, the fourth day is not new. It's an hidush. So Halel is not called for in that situation. All right, we'll skip some of what it says here. So that's one idea that it goes on to say, and then it asks why we say Halel on Rosh Chodesh, and why don't we say it on Shabbat, etc. Then it goes on to say, the third paragraph, Waha Hanukkah Dola Hache Wala Hache Waka'amar. In other words, previously the Talmud said when you have a special Korban Musaf, which is unique to this day, you say Hallel, a special full Hallel. And also it has to be called a Mu'edh. It said in the first paragraph, La ikra Mu'edh. Why on Shabbat don't we say Hallel? We also have a Korban Musaf every Shabbat. So why don't we say Hallel every Shabbat? Because it's not called a Mu'edh. And Mu'edh is a special day, not something that constantly reappears once a week. So Hanukkah is not called the Mu'edh min Torah Vadai. Excuse me. So Hanukkah, which is not min Torah Bichlal, is not a Mu'edh. It's also there's no Korban Musaf for Hanukkah. So why do we say Hallel? Waha Hanukkah dala hache wala hache v'ka'amar. And we do say Hallel mishum nisa, because of the nes. Now again, most people reading this section from the Talmud would immediately say, well, obviously it's talking about Nes Prach Hashemet, correct? Certainly that Haredi Avrech, or wasn't even Avrech at that time, he was still unmarried, as I recall, and knew him quite well. He would have said, no, you see, Nes, Nisa. Alright, so let's read the next line. What does it say now in the Talmud? Purim, Leika Nisa, Lema. So why don't we say Hallel on Purim? Because there was a Nes, right? So why don't we say Hallel on Purim? Wait a second. What Nes was there on Purim?
Nes Apitela. Low.
So it was not a supernatural. There was no supernatural Nes. In other words, you see from here clearly, we know very well that even Shem Hashem is not mentioned in Megillat Esther. There was no supernatural event. Everything can be explained as the machinations of history of human beings, whatever it is. We see Yad Hashem b'chol davar, but it's not written for us anywhere there was any Nes. There was no Nes, in the sense that the word Nes is normally used by us incorrectly. We usually assume that the word Nes means a supernatural miracle, but that's not what the word means. A Nes is something that stands out. Like the pasuk, Nothatha lire'echa nes lehitnoses, it says in Tehillim, and it's like a banner, something that stands tall and is visible and different and stands up from everything around it. So Purim was definitely an unusual set of events. That's for sure. Not something that happens very frequently, and it all led from one thing to the next and led to a very specific outcome. And that's called a Nes, Bilashon Chachamim. In the language of Chazal, that's called a Nes. The word Nes does not mean a supernatural miracle, necessarily. It sometimes does, and often it does not, as we see here clearly. So if the Talmud here says, Purim, we would say, or we would think that you would have to say Hallel on Purim because of the Nes, and then the answer given by the Talmud is not because there was no Nes, there was a supernatural Nes. No. Amar Rabbi Yitzhak lefi she'eno omerim shira ala nes sheb'chutz la'aretz. Because for a salvation, such an unusual event that takes place in Chutz la'aretz, when Am Yisrael still remain foreigners in a foreign land and are not independent and sovereign in their own land, we don't say Hallel for such an event. It's true there was a great Hatzalah, there was a Yeshua in that sense, Vadai, but not the kind of Nes, not the kind of Yeshua that took place at the time of Hanukkah. And that's what the Talmud goes on to discuss here. Shelo mi shenichnesu la'aretz lo huchsharu kol ha'arasot lomar shira, as it says at the beginning of the Mechillah, etc. So an event of national significance in Eretz Yisrael, where there's a national Yeshua, Hatzalah, and victory over our enemies, etc. in Eretz Yisrael, that mimawet lahayim, mi'aruth lahirut, as it says in Masechet Megillah, that calls, then Hallel is called for, but not in other situations. And Purim, even though there was a Hatzalah mimawet lahayim, it was nes shebechutz la'aretz. It did not affect the national status of the Jewish people. They remained in the same galut as before. So Hallel is not required and not called for. So we see clearly that suggestion is completely fallacious. Now back to what the Talmud said in Masechet Shabbat at the bottom of page 3. My Hanukkah. What is the question? What does that mean, my Hanukkah? Rashi says, Al eze nes kiva'ua. Kiva'ua is in the feminine. So, lichora, and this is how most people understand it, kiva'ua refers to Hanukkah. For what reason was the nes, or this institution of this Chag, this special period of Hanukkah instituted? Al eze nes kiva'ua, and then it goes on to tell the story of Nes Pach Hashemin. So many people therefore conclude from that the ikar of Hanukkah and the reason for Hanukkah is Nes Pach Hashemin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam she'akol niyeh b'dvaro.
Amen.
The Maharsha understands the question of the Talmud differently. The Maharsha says as follows: "V'lo ka'amar hacha my Hanukkah ela me'eze nes kav'u oto lahadlik bo neroth." The question, says the Maharsha, is why was there a takana to light candles during Hanukkah? Not why is there a period of time and a celebration called Hanukkah. No, the question specifically is why do we light candles on Hanukkah? So Lichora, the Maharsha is explaining it differently from Rashi. That is one reasonable conclusion. But it's also possible to say, after all, the words "my Hanukkah," the question of the Talmud, the Lashon of the Talmud was not "my Ner Hanukkah," but "my Hanukkah." And nevertheless, the Maharsha says that the question is, why do we light candles on Hanukkah? Which we'll see is a question that repeats itself in other sources. And that's a different question. If, according to what the Maharsha says, therefore, the Talmud asks, why do we light candles on Hanukkah? And the answer given was Nes Pach Hashemin. Whereas according to what we understood previously from Rashi, you might understand that the whole institution of Hanukkah is only because it is based on the fact of Nes Pach Hashemin. But then I thought to myself, the word ner, B'Lashon Chazal, is feminine. In modern Hebrew, as it is in the Tanakh also, ner is zachar, Lashon zachar, ner echad, shnei neroth, shelosha neroth. But B'Lashon Chachamim, they say, kovatha en zakukla. The ner is Lashon nekeva. There are many words which can go either way. In B'Lashon Chazal, a ner is nekeva. So, al eze nes kava'ua, you could understand in Rashi also, he's referring to the ner, just like the Maharsha, in other words. So that maybe there's no difference at all between Rashi and the Maharsha. It also is reasonable to understand the Talmud in that way, because the whole discussion there in Masechet Shabbat, Perek B'mei Madlikin, B'mei Madlikin, of course, discusses Ner Shabbat, Be'ikar. It's talking about what kind of oil and what kind of pethilot you may use for Neroth Shabbat. And then, because of that discussion, it also touches upon things to do with Ner Hanukkah, which is a similar mitzvah. So it makes a lot of sense to understand that the question being asked was, why do we have this mitzvah to light candles on Hanukkah? Now, beyond that, if we look at on page 2, here we have the original Lashon of Megillat Ta'anith that I mentioned before, which is divided into a Mishnah and a Perush, or a Gemara. The Gemara is essentially Beraitoth that were added later to the Guf of the Mishnah, to the Ikar of Megillat Ta'anith. So at the top you have the Mishnah, which we saw before, 25 b'Chislev, or 25 The Lashon here is Hanukkah Timanaya Yumin Delala Mispat Bahon. Slightly different Girasa, different reading, but the same content. And then we have no less than 7 additional statements in Megillat Ta'anith regarding this period of Hanukkah. So let's read what it says. The first one is Aleph, כשנכנסו יבנים להיכל וטימאו כל השמנים שבהיכל וכשגברה יד בית השמונאי וניסחום בדקו ולא מצאו אל פח אחד שהיה מונח בחותמו של כהן גדול שלא נטמא ולא היה בו להדליק אלא יום אחד ונעשה בו נס והדליקו ממנו 8 ימים לשנה אחרת קבעום 8 ימים טובים. And that's essentially what we saw in the Talmud Bavli. And then we have a number of other statements also attached to this Mishnah in Megillat Ta'anith. It says in Beth, Umar Ula Asod Hanukkah 8 yamim. Why is Hanukkah 8 days? What's the question? The question is, normally a Hanukkah of the Mikdash, of the Mizbeach, is 7 days. That's what it says. V'halo Hanukkah she'asa Moshe b'midbar lo asa ela shivat yamim. When they constructed the Mishkan and they had a Hanukkah, they inaugurated the Mishkan, there was a special period of 7 days, not 8 days. And everything, and Hanukkah, the word Hanukkah that we use all the time means Hanukkah HaMizbeach, Hanukkah HaMikdash. In other words, la milashon hinuch, la hanoch. In other words, to begin the active use and normal activity of something is la hanochoto, to enter into use. So Moshe Rabbeinu's Hanukkah of the Mishkan was 7 days. V'chem asinu b'Hanukkah she'asa Shlomo. When Shlomo built the first Mikdash, it was 7 days, not 8. Ela shiva yamim. Shenemar ki Hanukkah HaMizbeach asu shivat yamim ve'ahar shivat yamim. They had 7 days Hanukkah HaMizbeach and 7 days Sukkot. It says Mefurash, Hanukkah HaMizbeach was 7 days. It's a pasuk Mefurash in Divrei Yamim. So why do we have 8 days? That's the question. Mara ula asol Hanukkah zo. This particular Hanukkah, to do with the Hanukkah of the Mikdash, after the revolt by the Hashmonaim, which was the middle of the period of the Beit Sheni, essentially. Why was it 8 days? Ela b'yamei malchut Yavan nichnasu b'nei Hashmonai להיכל, ובנו את המזבח, וסדוהו בסיד, ותקנו בו כלי שרת, והיו מתעסקים בו 8 ימים. The answer given here in this Baraitha is that when the Hashmonaim and their followers entered the Mikdash, they found the Mikdash in a terrible state of disrepair. It had not been used for a long time. The Mizbah Tamid had been Mehulal, had been used for Avodah Zarah by the Yewanim, as is Mefurash in Sefer Maccabim Aleph, Lamashal, that they placed an idol of Zeus on the Mizbeach, or next to the Mizbeach, and they were makriv hazirim, pigs, and etc., etc. So such a Mizbeach can no longer be used l'shem shamayim, for l'avodat hamikdash. So what do you do with such a thing? You have to tear it apart, take the whole thing down, stone by stone, remove all of those stones, everything. It's all tameh. Avodah zarah metama has to be removed, and a new Mizbeach has to be built. And that takes at least a few days, at least. And there are other things to do. Menorah, lechem apanim. There's all kinds of things that need to be put back in working order so that you can have a Hanukkah HaMizbeach. And so it says here in this Baraitha, so when they entered the Mikdash after a period of some years, they had to rebuild the Mizbeach and produce klei shareth, and they were busy doing this for 8 days. It took them 8 days to get everything up and running, and therefore Hanukkah was set for 8 days. Lichora, this Baraitha is giving a different reason altogether from the first Baraitha. The two things do not go together at all. These are two different explanations. In Gimel, it just has a brief statement about why we celebrate Hanukkah for all time, because we don't celebrate Hanukkah Mishkan Shel Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't celebrate that today. We don't celebrate Hanukkah HaMizbeach Shel Shlomo today as well. So why do we celebrate this Hanukkah for all time. ולמה היא נוהגת לדורות? This is Gimel. שעשוה בצאתם מישראל לרווחה ואמרו בה הלל והודיה. In other words, you see מפורש, Halel has to do with יציאה מישראל לרווחה. In other words, salvation and victory, and therefore these days were established for all time as of days of Hodaya. The Ikar of Hanukkah, and this has to be understood, is Hodaya Lashem. That's the Ikar of everything, including the candles. And that's how, if you look in, I didn't bring it here, but if you look in Shiltot the Rabbi Gaon, that's how it begins, the section on Hanukkah, that we're chayav to Lodot Lashem for all Nisim and Yeshuot, etc., etc. That's how it begins the discussion. That's the Ikar. It goes on to say in Dalet, why do we light candles? The same Lichora, the same question that Talmud Bavli asked. They didn't have a menorah. The menorah is made of solid gold, and the Greeks didn't leave it there. They took it. So what do you do? And they didn't have enough gold available at that time. שנכנסו בני חשמונאי להיכל הביאו 7 שיפודי ברזל וחיפום בבעס והדליקו. And there's another girsah which says that they covered them in wood, ba'es, not ba'as, but ba'es, وهدلكوا بهم بثانيروth. In other words, they produced a very simple, low-cost menorah, not from gold, because they didn't have gold. And from this, by the way, we have a halakha l'doroth, that whenever Am Yisrael needs to produce a menorah and gold is not available at that moment, you produce it from whatever you have to hand. You make it of that material. That's halakha pesuka Mishneh Torah the Rambam, based on what it says mefurash in the Talmud, and here we have it written here mefurash. So the reason we light candles, according to this, again, nothing to do with Nespach Hashemen, has to do with the fact that, but you may ask nevertheless, so why did they why did they focus on the candles? The answer is, if you take note of what we say in Al Nisim, you'll see it says there as well. It says, "Ahal kach ba'u vanecha lidvi be'etecha, b'tiaru et mikdashecha, v'yidliku neroth v'hasrot kodshecha." That's not the only thing they did. They didn't just light candles. They didn't light the menorah as well, but they also did other things. They brought korbanot, etc. So why the focus? Why the mention dafka of the menorah? Because, as we said, the mikdash was in a state of disrepair, and it was mehulal. The simplest and easiest thing to begin with, that requires very little effort, is a menorah. As we said, they brought some pieces of iron and some wood, and they cobbled together a simple menorah, and they were able to start being madlik a menorah every day, immediately. That didn't require any delay. Taking down the whole mizbeach and rebuilding the mizbeach, etc., that takes time. But the menorah was the first thing they were able to do immediately. And therefore, the menorah became a symbol of the entire event, and the whole set of events, and the outcome. And Hanukkah HaMizbeach, the menorah was the first and therefore the very significant thing that they were able to do immediately, and that became a symbol of everything to do with Hanukkah. And that's what it says here. Which we don't do on other chagim. We have other chagim which have to do with the Yeshua and the Hatzalah and the salvation, like Purim. We don't light candles on Purim. And that's what it says here in Dalet. It says the fish nichnasu, etc. They didn't have a menorah, and they made one. Hevil shiva shipodei barzel, etc. And this is a mitzvah that you can tell people everywhere to do. What is simpler? What easier mitzvah is than to light a candle? Lighting a candle is a very simple thing. Everyone, anyhow, lights candles in those days. Any evening comes by, it's dark, especially in the winter. You light candles in the home. Say you light one more candle and you put it outside the door. That's the whole thing. But it's a very simple mitzvah. It's not very expensive, but it's very meaningful, and we see that to this day. We see that all kinds of Jews are very happy to light Nerot Hanukkah. Not necessarily quite so happy. They won't go out of their way to do Nitilat Lulav or to or 101 other things perhaps. But to light Nerot Hanukkah is a very very popular mitzvah. That has to do with the fact that Hanukkah is actually all about Zehut Yehudit. It's all about Jewish identity. Because the rebellion and the war were entirely of a religious nature. In other words, all the Jews in Eretz Yisrael at that time could have chosen to live as Mithyabanim, and they would have been left alone. But you couldn't live as a Jew. You could die as a Jew, or you could live as a Mithyawen, as a Hellenist. But you couldn't live as a Jew. And for that, they're willing to fight. They're willing to take tremendous risks and pull off one of the truly a miraculous chain of events that led, as we will see in the Rambam presently, to a very significant outcome. In the first place, it saved the Jews from oblivion. The Jews would have disappeared. If there was no Hanukkah, there would be no Jewish people today. We wouldn't be here sitting around this table, and we wouldn't even know that we were Jewish. There wouldn't be any such thing. This was a one-time history-making event, an earth-shattering event. And we see this clearly in Rambam, as we'll see in a moment. But I'll also give you one more reason why we have 8 days of Hanukkah. And this appears on page 3 at the top. Sefer Hashmonaim Bet. There are 4 books known as Sefer Hashmonaim or Sefer Maccabim. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. Aleph is the serious historical document that we have, which is a very accurate and comprehensive record of the events of that time. The only other equally comprehensive and accurate account is Yosef Matityahu, Josephus Flavius. He also describes the events in detail. Hashmonaim Beth has a number of very dubious stories and statements in it, but it has one very simple statement. And there are 2 statements actually, as I have them here. It says, "B'yothenu," here the Hashmonaim are announcing to the Jews in Alexandria and Chutz La'aretz why there's this new Chag called Hanukkah. And they say to them, "B'yothenu nechonim la'asot b'chodesh Kislev b'chamisha v'esrim bo et Chag Taharat HaMikdash." First of all, what do they call this Chag? Chag Taharat HaMikdash. "Ra'inu l'vi'achem l'ma'an tasu gam atem Chag HaSukkot." Now what does that mean? Chag Taharat HaMikdash, and you should also do Chag HaSukkot. Very strange statement. It doesn't make a great deal of sense until you read the next statement, which appears a few chapters later. And there it says, "Vayachogu et shemonat hayamim besimcha kechag HaSukkot." In other words, for 8 days. "Bezochram et ra'atham lifnei zeman ma b'chag HaSukkot beharim u'v'me'arot kahayot hasadeh." In other words, before they were able to overcome the Greco-Syrians and arrive in Yerushalayim and liberate the Machon Mikdash and enter the Mikdash and then take care of what had to be done in order to reactivate it. 2 months before that, in the month of Tishrei, where were they? They were in the middle of the war still. And the war didn't end at that point either, by the way. This was just a lull in the fighting. But they had been fighting in a war. They had been living, as it says, Hayot Hasadeh, Beharim U'Bame'aroth. The Gevurah, the Mesilut Nefesh of our forefathers at that time is truly remarkable. They were unable, therefore, to celebrate Chag HaSukkot, not with Sukkot and not with Arbat HaMinim. And it says, therefore, that they saw their celebration of Chanukhat HaMizbeach for 8 days as a kind of tashlumim for Sukkot. And that's another reason for the 8 days, according to Sefer Hashmonaim. Now let us look at the Rambam. Rambam says on page number 1, Rambam says, and keep in mind, by the way, Sefer Maccabim Aleph or Sefer Hashmonaim Aleph Bet, etc., were written originally in Hebrew, or at least Aleph was. That's the main one. Was written originally in Hebrew. We don't have the original Sefer Maccabim in Hebrew. We have it. It was, strangely enough, it was preserved for us by the Christians. At least some of the Orthodox Christian churches, I think also maybe the Catholics, they preserved it. They had a Greek version of it. And what we have today in Hebrew is actually a translation from the Greek back to the Hebrew. And that's why there's more than one translation. But one gets a clear idea of what's going on. It's very good. They're a good the translations are good, and you see this Maccabim Aleph is a very accurate, detailed account, written apparently by an eyewitness, maybe even some suggest a soldier in the army of Yudah Maccabi, or at least someone who was very close to the events. Whereas Hashmonaim Bet, for example, was written by a Jew who lived in Alexandria in Egypt. And they're already in a different place altogether. They didn't really know what was going on. It's like going today to a Jew living in Texas and asking him to explain what's going on in Israel. He doesn't necessarily know. And he may imagine all kinds of things, but they may not be true. So here we're about to read something in the Rambam, and there's a question that you have to keep in mind before we even begin to read the Rambam. And that is, where did the Rambam get this information from? Because does not appear in the Talmud Bavli. The only thing in the Talmud Bavli it talks about is what we read. About the Shemen, Nespach HaShemen. And yet Rambam says other things here, and you have to wonder where he got this information from. It says, Bevayis Sheni, Keshem Alechu Yawan, Gazeru Gezerot Al Yisrael, Vitalud Datham. So they outlawed Judaism and introduced a government policy of persecution against Jews and Judaism. So again, you couldn't live as a Jew. You could live as a Goy, you could die as a Jew, but you couldn't live as a Jew. And if you, and they one of the Gezerot was, they forbade circumcision on penalty of death, keeping Shabbat, studying Torah. They also there was a gezerah with regards to Rosh Chodesh as well. There's also they made a gezerah that every Jewish kala had to be taken to the local governor first, the first night of her marriage night, etc. This is very, very interesting. We have some interesting information about that. For example, I didn't bring it here, but in the Mirsky edition of the Shiltot that we have, Shiltot Rav Hai Gaon, where he published certain additional sections from the Shiltot that were considered lost, and he found them in the Ktav Yad. So it mentions there, for example, that one of the things they used to do, how did they had to try and keep a circumcision secret, and yet they wanted some people to come. So what did they do? This is mentioned in the Shiltot. So this is written something like 1400 or so years ago. He says that they used to place a certain kind of candle in the window during the daylight hours when you don't normally have candles in the window, and people would that would be a sign that in this house there's going to be tomorrow or something, there's going to be a Brit Milah, so people would know. So that was one way of doing these things. Another thing to do with a Jewish bride, you couldn't do a chuppah in a public manner, because then the goyim would know, and they would come and find this bride and take her away. So they used to place candles in the windows during the day in a certain agreed upon, understood fashion, so that people would know that tonight, let's say, the wedding a secret wedding will take place here in this house. So and this may be connected, for example, to the minhag that we see amongst the Ashkenazim of walking with the hatan and the kala to the chuppah with candles. Why would you walk to the chuppah with candles? Faradim don't do it, for example. Temanim don't do it. It's not as if there's any halakha or cogent reason why you need to have a candle, unless you want to say, well, because it was probably at night and there was no street lights, because they didn't have street lighting, they didn't have electricity, so they had candles. That might be, but some have suggested, and it's quite possible, this is a zecher le'oto inyan, that candles became associated with weddings for this reason. And the Rambam says, look, Rambam, who's not a historian, and he couldn't have read these texts of Hashmonaim Aleph, etc., in Greek. Rambam did not know Greek. We know that. And these texts were lost by the Jewish people sometime before the Rambam, maybe even a long time before. So but Rambam must have seen, first of all, what it says in the Shil Toth, and maybe he had other sources that he saw as well, but certainly he must have seen the Shil Toth. And Rambam understood from those sources what he writes here, which does not appear in the Talmud Bavli, because here Rambam says that which you don't find, for example, in the Torah, in number 2. The Torah just quotes the Talmud Bavli as it states there. There was oil, they found 1 container of oil, etc., etc. That's all the Torah says, straight out of the Talmud Bavli. But he doesn't. What does the Torah say? He says, number 2, the second line, He just talks about these goyim who came from no place, entered the Mikdash, made everything tameh, and then the Hashmonim came along and needed oil, and they found some oil. Rambam doesn't do that at all. Rambam tells you, there was a deliberate policy of shemad to uproot Judaism and ban Jews living as Jews. They couldn't. They were banned on pain of death from studying Torah and keeping mitzvot, such as Milah, as we said, Shabbat. See, Rambam here is explicitly hinting at what we spoke about, this gezerah of the first night, to do with the bride. Rambam knew about this. He's writing it very briefly, but he says Mufurash, Pashatu Yadam b'mamunam uvivnothehem. V'nichnesu la'ichal. That also, they entered the Mikdash, ufarasu bo parasot, and they destroyed parts of it, v'timu'u at-taharoth. That's true. V'thar lahem lisa ma'od mipanehem ulahasum lahas gadol. So the Jewish people, Rambam is describing a great upheaval in the life of the Jewish people, a tremendous persecution, a terrible period. None of this is mentioned before us in the Talmud. So clearly Rambam saw some sources. One of them is apparently the newly found or rediscovered parts of the Shil Toth, and other sources that Rabbeinu Saidagan also apparently saw. Now it says Hashem saved them. It doesn't say how he saved them. It says Hashem saved them. But now he tells you how. Now the Hashmonim were not all Kohanim Gedolim. In fact, none of them were Kohanim Gedolim. So the word Kohanim Gedolim means the very important, outstanding, honorable Kohanim. That is also how I think you should understand the Nusach in most versions of Ara Nisim, where it talks about Matityahu ben Yohanan Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol means he was Adam Chashul, the great, like saying, like Alexander the Great. So you had Matityahu the Great. So there were these Jews, these Hashmonim, these Kohanim, who began this armed uprising, and it became a great popular movement, because most of the Jews, not all, there were a significant number of Mithyaonim amongst the Jews. We don't have exact numbers, but it seems that at least 20% of the Jews in the country, maybe more, were Mithyaonim, but a majority were certainly not. and they joined this uprising. And then they found themselves all of a sudden in a situation which the Jewish people had not been in for many centuries. In other words, they were able to establish their own sovereign Jewish government, something that hadn't happened since Churban Bayit Rishon. So, and we're talking here about a period of about 400 years. And Rambam says, وَحَزْرَ مَلْخُوث لِيِسْرَائِيل يَثَيْرَ الْمَثَائِمْ شَنَا عَذَا حُرْبَانَ الشَّنِي. And Jewish rule or Jewish independence returned for a period of 200 years up to the time of the Churban. This statement, we know where Rambam took it from. Rambam saw this in a document, which is not an historically accurate document, called Megillat Antiochus, which is a brief, somewhat fanciful document, which was read by certain Eidot, certain communities of Jews in the world, such as the Temanim and such as the Jews in Algeria, etc. On Purim, on Hanukkah they would read it, on Shabbat. It's not very long. And there it makes this statement. It's in Aramaic. It says that the it also actually, I even have this same Megillat Antiochus appears also in some Sidurim Nusach Ashkenaz, some accurate older Sidurim Nusach Ashkenaz. So apparently the Ashkenazim also at some point used to read it. And there it says at the end of that book that the Jews regained independence of 200 years. Now the truth is that it's roughly 200 years from the time of the revolt till the Churban Bayit Sheni. But we also know that historically, from 66 BCE, the Jews were no longer independent. That's when Pompey entered Eretz Yisrael with his legions and basically took over. So that figure is not actually accurate. It's accurate in terms of, it describes the time from the Mered till the Churban of Bayit Sheni, but that period was not really, most of that period, not more than 80 years was there actually Jewish sovereign independence, approximately. Now Rambam, what does Rambam say further in Halakha Bet? So Rambam first of all talks a great deal about the war, right? He talks about Gavru b'nei Hashmonai, Harechum, Hoshiu Yisrael miyadam, Ha'imidu melech min ha'kohanim, Hazra malchut liYisrael, Uchesh Gavru in Halakha Bet al oivehem u'ibedum, v'hamisha v'esrim b'chodesh Kislev haya, v'nichnesu la'echal. Now look how what Rambam writes. We know where that comes from. And it was only sufficient for one day. They lit from that oil, they lit the neroth of the menorah for 8 days. That also doesn't say any place. Where does it say that statement that they were able, until they were able to produce olive oil, etc., shemen tahor? But you should note that Rambam does not use the word nes in this regard. Here he doesn't say that. He says hidliku imenu nerot hamaracha shmona yamim. He doesn't say there was a miracle. He said, now you could achieve that by doing a number of things. For instance, you could divide the oil and light the menorah for a shorter period of time. Right? It's supposed to be lit the whole time, but let's say you don't have enough oil, so you could light for an hour a day, shall we say, for 8 days until you can get some more oil. From Rambam, it's not mefurash there was an es pach Hashem. It says they found a pach that was tahor, and they were able to use it for 8 days. But how they used it, and whether it was some supernatural miracle, it doesn't actually say such a thing here in the Rambam. Now, when Rambam says in Halakha Gimel, to what is he referring? I understand, I think this is how you must understand, that he's referring to everything that he mentioned in the previous two halachot, not just the last mention of the pach. He's referring to the entire historical period and all those events that we just mentioned. מפני זה התקינו חכמים שבאותו הדור שיהיו 8 הימים האלו שתחילתן מלילה 25 בכסלו ימי שמחה והלל. So first of all, again, Rambam also, and Rambam is one of the earlier sources that explicitly mentions that Hanukkah yemei simha, that there's an inyan lismach b'hem. For instance, to have gatherings like we're having right now. The Maharshal bases himself on the Rambam when he says that there is a mitzvah to have a seudat mitzvah on Hanukkah, even though it's not mufurash. But in the Rambam it's mufurash. He said yemei simha v'halel. And ומדליקים בהם הנרות בערב על פתחי הבתים בכל לילה וימים אלו הם הנקראים חנוכה, and these days are called Hanukkah, etc. Now, we already mentioned on page 2, number 3, that in Megillat Ta'anith we find a number of different reasons why we light candles on Hanukkah. Right? We have the reason mentioned by the Talmud Bavli, which is the number, which is Aleph here, which is the Nes Pach Hashem, where it does talk about a Nes Mefurash, which the Rambam seems quite deliberately to have omitted. Then we also have in Daled Mara Udadliket HaNerot, and then it says because that was the first mitzvah they were able to perform when they returned to the Mikdash. Doesn't say anything about Pach Hashemen. And we have a similar source also on page 4, the Psikata Rabbathi. Here also you find something similar. It says Yilamudenu Rabbenu Ner shel Hanukkah me'mathai hu hi miswato. You see here also Ner is he, Shon Nekeva, right? Ner shel Hanukkah me'mathai hi miswato. It should say Lichora miswatha, but anyway. Shanu Rabboten Umi shetishka hama al shetisalek rov harechel min hashuk ulehechan hayu madlikim. It could be something that's missing here, or maybe not. Maybe it's saying a chidush. If you haven't got a petach of a bite, what do you do? Hayad dar ba'aliyah uva halon notay l'reshut harabim madlik. So you lighten the window if that's the best you have. That's fine also. And then it goes on to say, the next paragraph, V'lama madlik nerot b'Hanukkah Ela b'sha'ah shenischu b'nabano shel Hashmonai HaKohen HaGadol HaMalchut Yawan shenemar v'oralti v'nayich Zion al v'nayich Yawan nichnesu levet HaMikdash Nasa'u sham shmona shipudim shel barzel. They were able to gather together 8 pieces of iron, pig iron basically, simple iron, and this was the first mitzvah they were able to perform, and that therefore we like as a zechel adavar, and because it symbolizes all of those events which culminated in the Hanukkah of the Mizbeach. Therefore we have this mitzvah of Ner Hanukkah. No mention again of Pach Hashem. You will also note that in Al Nisim there's no mention of Pach Hashem. My conclusion, to put it simply, is there was no Nes Pach Hashem in the simple sense that people understand. Not because I think that Hashem cannot make oil burn longer than that normally is the case. As it says in Masechet Ta'anith, Daf Kaf Hey, the daughter of a certain Chacham, she didn't have oil. She put for Ner Shabbat, she placed hometz in the candles, and she didn't know what else to do. And her father said to her, Misha amar Hashem en she'yidlok, yomar la hometz v'yidlok. Hashem can make anything happen, Vadai. But if you see so many sources that give varying answers and reasons in response to the question, why 8 days, why do we light candles, bichlal, etc., and you have these various sources, and only in one of those sources do you find the concept of Nes Pach Hashem, which then Rambam doesn't even describe in precisely those terms. It's not unreasonable at all to assume that this is something more of a popular legend that people people like to, either because Jews in Chutz La'aretz couldn't understand the events altogether, which shouldn't seem strange to us, as long as if you can explain what living in Israel is like to a Jew living in New York or in or wherever. Many things are just not understood or not comprehended and don't make sense. And Jews in Bavel, for example, did not know they've never heard of Jews who put together an army and fought off an empire and were successful. These are things that were beyond the ken and the belief of Jews in Chutz La'aretz. They're almost beyond the belief of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael as well. So in order to have some way of telling a story about such a thing that you can't understand, you can understand where such a thing might come up from, may arise. That's one way of looking at it. You could also, I've also come across another couple of explanations. First of all, as we already explained, that it's clear that we don't have Hanukkah because of Nes Hashem. That's a complete misunderstanding. And by the way, the Maharal says this explicitly at the end of page 4, a brief quote from his book Ner Mitzvah. He writes, "V'od yesh lomar she'ikar ma she'kavu yemei Hanukkah." Why do we have Hanukkah? B'shvil shayu menaschim et haYevanim. Because of the victory and the wars and the teshuot and the milhamot against the Yevanim. As we say, Ala nisim ha'gevrot teshuot ha'milhamot. It doesn't say anything about Nes b'Hashem. Rak shelo haya nir'eh shaya kan niftachon hazeh l'yedei nes she'asa zeh Hashem yitbarech. V'lo haya zeh mikocham u'gvurotam. But it wasn't entirely obvious that it was Yad Hashem. Ulefichach na'asa nes, says the Maharal, al yedei nerot hamenorah, sheyed'u she'akol haya b'nes min Hashem yitbarech. There was all b'hashkachat Hashem. V'chach ha'milchama she'yu menaschim haya min Hashem yitbarech. Another way of, I heard another way of something similar to this. There's a famous question that many people ask, or has been asked over the ages. Why do we not have a Masechet Hanukkah in the Mishnah? We have a Masechet Bechila, we don't have a Masechet Hanukkah. Why not? So, certain Hachamim Be'enehem, people who consider themselves very clever, decided years ago to give the following explanation. That the Hashmonaim, who were Kohanim, the leaders of the revolt, the instigators of the revolt, were Kohanim, as we know, which is not surprising, by the way, as I've mentioned, I think, elsewhere, that Shevet Levi were always known for their willingness to take action immediately, as we see in the case of Shimon Levi in Shechem, as we see in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, who was Mishevet Levi, with the Misri, Vayareth ish Misri maka ish ivri me'eho, Vayifan koacho Vayar ki en ish, Vayachet ha-Misri, Vayitponehu b'hol. Moshe Rabbeinu killed an Egyptian because he was beating a Jewish man. That's how Moshe Rabbeinu enters history. Today he would be put on trial for murder and racism and something else, I'm sure, but the Torah thinks that it was apparently an admirable and very remarkable act on his part. And in fact, I think it's correct to say that this is why Moshe Rabbeinu was ra'ui to be the leader of the Jewish people, a Jewish leader who is not willing to risk his own neck for the Jewish people, is not worthy of being a leader of the Jewish people. You cannot be such a person. Jewish leadership requires tremendous mesirut nefesh and selflessness. And Moshe Rabbeinu was exactly such a person. And when Hashem later said to him, I will destroy the people after Het HaEger and I'll make you into a great people, he says, no, Meheni nami sifrecha. He was willing to to give up everything for the Jewish people. You see again and again Moshe Rabbeinu was his dedication to the Jewish people. Feeling of national identity and kana'uth for Am Yisrael is an essential part of the Torah l'maaseh, and therefore it's not surprising that Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah, and it's not surprising that Shevet Levi were mahazikei Torah and melamdei Torah. So here too we see the Hashmonaim were Kohanim. Kohanim come from Shevet Levi. So they began the Mered, which was then, they were joined by many others. And it's perfectly normal and natural that those who begin such a outstanding and unique set such a chain of events in motion, that they should find themselves nominated and to lead the people. You would expect such a thing. There would be that's the normal way of such things. Why was George Washington, the first president of the United States? Because he was the general who led them to victory against the British. It's very simple. He was worthy of that position. He was actually, I think, a very special man, George Washington, what I know. And he certainly was willing to risk his neck, which he did. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion that the rebels, the American rebels, would win. Not at all. But they did. And he immediately was elevated to become the first president. That's the natural course of historical events. So some people have pointed out, in fact, the Rambam is actually the first person to have suggested this. There are many who agree and many who disagree with the Rambam. The Rambam pointed out that the Hashmonaim actually sinned in that they took for themselves, as it were, the kingship or the head of the political leadership of the people, because they were Kohanim, and that's not for them. That's supposed to be for Shevet Yehuda. That's the claim of the Rambam. Whether this is a correct claim or not is an interesting discussion in itself. Some people took this idea further and said that, the reason there's no Masechet Hanukkah is because really the Chachamim didn't like the Hashmonaim very much, because they were angry at them for stealing, as it were, the Malchut for themselves. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who was from Beth David, from his mother's side, was also angry with them for that reason, and therefore he didn't write them into the Mishnah. All of that is Hevel Havalim Ureut Ruach for 101 reasons. First of all, Rabbi did not invent the Mishnah. The Mishnah already existed in a fairly well-known format of Shisha Sedarim and various Masechtot many generations before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Certainly already from the time of Hillel and Shammai, probably even well before that. In Shema Gedolim, the Haidah brings a Teshuvah, one of the Gaonim, where he says that when one of the Gaonim was Niftar, they found in his Genazim, in his private library, they found a Nusach of the Mishnah, Mi'emot Shammai Hillel. Rabbi redacted the Mishnah and edited a version of the Mishnah that we have today, that we use today, which was based on everything that preceded him. That's true, but he didn't invent the whole idea of which Masechet, how many Masechtot he said. That's not true. Second of all, even the claim that we have Masechet Mechila, so why don't we have Masechet Hanukkah, is also a somewhat strange claim, because if you look at Masechet Mechila, only the first part of the Masechet deals with things to do with Purim, whereas the rest of the Masechet has to do with Kriyat Torah, Bet Knesset, all sorts of other things, nothing to do with Purim. Purim is special and different. It was well before Hanukkah. It was Vizman Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and there was a Megillah was written lichvod that event. Whereas by the time Hanukkah comes along, there was no longer a willingness to invent so many new things, shall we say? So we don't find a Hanukkah, a Megillat Hanukkah. The Shadal explains in his Hakdamat to Sefer Yeshayahu why that is, because it's an interesting discussion itself. But basically, briefly, he says that because of the influence of the Yewanim, the Hityavnut that was taking place within Eretz Yisrael already for a long time. This is a point that everyone has to keep in mind. In what year, how many years after Alexander the Great and his armies conquered this part of the world, Eretz Yisrael and many other countries? We know that he conquered huge areas of the world, all the way to the big Western India and Egypt and all of Macedon and Greece and Persia, etc., huge areas, including Eretz Yisrael, including the Middle East. How many years after that conquest of Alexander the Great did the rebellion of the Hashmonaim begin? Any idea?
Around 200. Around 200.
It's actually 147. It's a long time, 147 years later. So you could ask, where were the Jews for the 147 years? Where were they? What was going on? Well, this is also a very interesting point. When you try and force the Jews to do something, they will not go along with it. They are a stiff-necked people. Am keshe oref. Yair Lapid, Shem Rashem Yirkav, learnt this the hard way also. When he tried to force Haredim to go to the army, the more he forced the issue, fewer Haredim wanted to go to the army. Before he started making such a fuss about it 10 years ago, the more Haredim were going to the army. As soon as you make it into something that you enforce by law, etc., they'll say, no thank you, forget it. If it's up to us, we'll think about it. Maybe we'll do this, maybe we won't, we'll see. But and many will. But if you force the issue, they won't. This is exactly what would happen with the Jews. The Yewanim, Alexander the Great, why did he want to conquer the whole world? Just because he liked conquering and fighting wars, which he was obviously a military genius, that goes without saying. And he was a very young man and very ambitious. He was 21 when he started his campaign. But it wasn't just a matter of military conquest. It was also a matter of disseminating Hellenistic culture. They considered their culture to be the pinnacle of human achievement, and they wanted everyone to benefit from Greek advance and culture and civilization, and that was an essential part of the Greek reality and view of things. Everyone who was not Greek was called a barbarian, right? That was the term. Anyone who was not Greek was barbarian by definition. And keep in mind that Alexander had a tutor, a rather famous one, by the name of Aristotle. And Aristotle apparently also thought that the Greeks had a few things to teach other people, and he was probably he and other people like him were all for Alexander going off and spreading their civilization around the world. So this was an essential part of what the Greeks were about, what they were trying to achieve. So they came to Eretz Yisrael, and of course their culture began to seep into the Jewish society as well. But there was no Gzerat Shmad, there was no official policy to force the Jews to become Goyim. It just was something that was happening over time, slowly, by osmosis. And it was happening. That's why we had all these Yewanim. They tended to be usually the more wealthy, the people who wanted to work with the Greeks in Greek government as tax collectors and senior officials and what have you. And they were quite happy to accept all the Greeks had to offer, and they honestly believed. A lot of these people truly believed, as you know, the great Shoftei Bagatz of today will tell you also, that their culture, their ideas, their system of values, their way of viewing the world is the highest and most sublime, and certainly the most correct interpretation of reality and of human existence. And the Greeks believed this, and the Yewanim, the Hellenists, believed this also. And they thought they were doing the Jews a favor if they were to force them to become Greek. just as another Rasha, Yair Golan, former Deputy Chief of Staff, said, not for the first time recently, that we have to re-educate all these Dati Leumi soldiers in the army. Well, we know what that means. And then they want to know why Haredim don't want to go to the army. As long as the Greeks didn't make it into a war, into an official policy to outlaw Judaism and force Jews to become goyim, things were going not too bad. There were increasingly many Jews who were Mithyonim and who turned some of them turned their back on Yahadut altogether. Others, they became, sort of vaguely modern Orthodox or something, whatever you want to call it. There were compromises and what have you. So more and more, the Shadal explains, as I said in his Hakdama to Yeshayahu, more and more Sfarim began to be written by people who had been somehow affected by, or infected, if you like, by Greek thinking, Greek civilization, Greek practices. So Hazal became increasingly wary of any book written in their own time. And that's why there was no chance for another Megillah being added to the Tanakh or something like that, because any book was from that period when Hityavnut had already had a very definite foothold within Eretz Yisrael. Anything was suspect, that it was somehow tainted. So the Shadal explains anyway. So to get back to Masechet Hanukkah, what on earth could you write Masechet Hanukkah about? What is there to write about? You light a candle, that's not complicated. It's true, the Talmud Bavli manages to make about three daf out of it, but that's it. You can't do more than that. You light a candle, you say Hallel, Hallel's known, it's discussed in Masechet Sukkah. You say Ala Nisim, well, that doesn't take a Masechet to discuss, so what else are you going to have a Masechet about? First of all, that's one question. So that's one point. Second of all, as we said, even Masechet Megillah doesn't really discuss Inyanei Purim for very long until it gets on to other things. So there was no need at any time for a Masechet Chanukah. But it is true that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and not just Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, all the people who experienced both the Mered HaGadol, the great revolt against the Romans, which led to the Churban, and then Mered Bar Kochva, which resulted in the fullness of time in a tremendous was a tremendous calamity for the Jewish people, from which the Jewish people did not really recuperate. Perhaps you could even say to the present day, or not until the present day, or something like that. It was a major blow to the Jewish people. It led to a major emptying out of Eretz Yisrael of Jews. Not completely, but a lot of Jews, many were killed, many were enslaved, many fled. Many Jews fled to Bavel. There was a tremendous hashash that if there was an attempt to play down a little bit the revolt and the warfare against the Greeks by the Jews, because they didn't want Jews to think that let's try this with the Romans as well, because they tried that already a few times and it hadn't worked out very well, to put it mildly. So there was definitely a desire to tell Jews, not a good idea to try this with the Romans, not now. Maybe if it waited 200 years after Bar Kochva, it would have been a good time, maybe. But the Roman Empire was much weaker at that point, or 300 years certainly. But not at that time. At that time, the Roman Empire was essentially at its height, at the peak of its power. It was beyond anything that any human power could imagine. So it is true that probably Rabbi and also other Chachamim tried to play down such acts of gevura, of milhama and mered, because they didn't want the Jews in their time to try this with the present Roman overlords. This is why we find in Midrash Shemot Lemashal, when it describes Moshe Rabbeinu with the Mitzri, so you have these opinions. There are those who explained the Maaseh Kivshuto, that Moshe got up, he saw what was going on, he killed the Mitzri, buried him in the sand, and eventually Paro heard, he had to flee, etc. But there are other Chachamim who say that Moshe Rabbeinu was only able to do this because he knew that no righteous person would come from this particular Mitzri, that all his descendants would be evil people. Or that he killed him not by striking him, but by using a Shema Mefurash or some such thing. Why do you have such midrashim? Precisely for that reason. To tell the Jews in Shul, when they hear on Parashat Shemot, they read about Moshe Rabbeinu and the Misri, don't get carried away, don't think you can do this, because you don't know how to use a Shema Furash, and you don't know about his descendants. It's not for you. That was the idea. That's quite obvious to anyone who has any understanding of such things. At the same time, in the same midrashim, you have another opinion which says V'chachamim omrim kivshuto. So both those opinions existed in that space. And I think the same thing is true with Hanukkah. If you and this is what the Maharal said, that the Nes Pach Hashem is a kind of confirmation that everything was b'hashgachat Hashem. Another way of wording that perhaps is to say, by talking about a Nes Pach Hashem, you introduce the Hashem's special hashgacha into the equation. In other words, basically saying you can't repeat the fact that the Hashmonim was successful. You see, is the fact that Hashem was behind them and supported them and caused these things to happen and work out the way they worked out, is because they had Hashem on their side in a very obvious fashion. Haraya Nesbach Hashem. You can't do that. You can't make a candle last longer than it's supposed to last, but they did. So that shows that you're not on their madriga and you can't do such things. That's another way of reading it, if you like. At any rate, the ikar of Hanukkah, with this I will end. The ikar of Hanukkah is, first of all, it's very important that we know the history, that we learn the history. That is why we should all ourselves and encourage our families, and it's possible, and I recommend that every day of Hanukkah to read with the family some of these works, whether it's something like Maccabim Aleph, Hashmonaim Aleph, to read it, which is quite long, so you have to sit down and maybe begin before Hanukkah and read a fair amount every day during Hanukkah, and then you'll get through all of it or most of it, and you have a good idea what went on. Without that, you really don't understand the tremendous monumental events that took place at that time, and the tremendous gevurah and mesirut nefesh of our forefathers. And it was entirely a religiously motivated war, which of course many Jews, as we said before, who do light candles, if they knew, they wouldn't light candles, so we don't have to tell them, but that's the fact. It was a completely Torah based, for Torah, by Torah, for the Jews who wanted to be Anshe Torah. And that's what we say in Al Nisim, in the more accurate Nuskhaot. Ufo She'im, those are the Mithyawonim, B'yad Osei Torah. There were the two kinds of Jews, Po She'im, those are the Mithyawonim, and the Osei Torah. The other Nusach is Zedim B'yad Osei Torah. It's the same thing, different words, but the same idea. The term Posheim comes from Sefer Yehezkel, Perek Kaf, right? It talks then, Sefer Yehezkel talks about Posheim HaMoradim, and that term is a more authentic term. And probably was censored in some way, that's why you have the other version. But either way, they mean the same thing. So first of all, it's very important to learn the history. Dr. Hagi Ben Arzi, who happens to be Bibi Netanyahu's brother-in-law, who's very knowledgeable about many areas of history and Tanakh. He was Khatan Tanakh when he was a teenager. Chidon Tanakh. So he's written a booklet called Megillat Hanukkah, which you can get, and it gives you a brief summary of all these events in 8 chapters. You read one chapter every day, you get the general picture. It's very good. It's excellent. I highly recommend it. He's written a number of other Meghilot. He wrote a Megillah on Sheshet HaYamim, Yom Kippurim, other things, Yemei HaChurban, all sorts of Mered v'Churban. Megillat Hanukkah, I think, was the first one he wrote, and so it's very good. Highly recommend it. Second is to know that our forefathers were willing to risk everything to remain Jews. Mothers were willing to risk their lives and their children's lives and do a Brit Milah. It was often the women who did this. They ran off with their child somewhere in a cave and they performed the Brit Milah somehow. If they were found out, their lives could be easily forfeit. Jews.
In the same Gemara, it's forbidden to woman to do a Brit Milah. And Gemara brought it up.
Machon. I didn't say they did it themselves, but they arranged it. It also says in Masechet Shabbat, Kol miswa she'mosaru nafsham alea nitkayma biyadam. And the example of that is Milah. V'chol miswa she'lo mosaru nafsham alea lo nitkayma biyadam. And then the Dugma of the Gemara is tefillin. That when there was a gezerah against tefillin, people stopped wearing tefillin. But Brit Milah was never dropped. They never managed to force the Jews to stop doing Brit Milah. It's an amazing thing when you think about it. It's truly amazing. And again, you see, it's interesting. Again, to this day, you see, most Jews do a Brit Milah, whether they're Dati or not Dati. They do a Brit Milah. The vast majority, 95% or something. And the same is true of Ner Hanukkah. Many Jews love Ner Hanukkah. So you see that when Am Yisrael is Moseret HaNefesh, it does something, even thousands of years into the future. יהי רצון שנזכה לראות בניסים, גבורות, תשועות ומלחמות, עד שנברך בעזרת השם על המוגמר, שנראה את כל שונאינו מוטלים לפנינו, ונודה להשם בשבח והודיה. אמן כן יהי רצון.
In light of how they try to downplay all this, by whom and how and when was it established as a chag?
There was a Sanhedrin, there was a Bet Din Gadol at that time. And the Hashmonaim had a Bet Din, which this was discussed and enacted at that time.
Okay, but they tried to just downplay the.
That was much later. That was already in the Roman period. We're talking about another 3 centuries later. At that time, they had just been victorious. They didn't have anything to be concerned about. Not very concerned. Later, having tried to revolt against the Romans, 2 major revolts, which did not succeed in, which led to tremendous destruction, then there was definitely a policy to essentially downplay the more militaristic, nationalistic aspects of these events. That's what we see in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Lamed Gimel. Rabbi Yehuda is praising the Romaim for building bathhouses and roads in Eretz Yisrael, which is all very true and all very well, but you can't really think that Rabbi Yehuda thought the Romans were a wonderful bunch of wonderful chaps and is very pleased that they came here and took over and did what they did. No. Rabbi Shimon was more of a firebrand, and he said, Kol ma she'asu l'tovat asmam asu, don't praise them, and even though I know why you're doing it, don't say anything good about them, because Rabbi Shimon was more of a, if you want to say, a hothead. And Rabbi Yehuda was more circumspect. There were these different trends and feelings and attitudes amongst the Chachamim because of certain events that took place. In the long run, we need both. We need both Chachamim who will be firebrands and will not think twice. You always need Kanaim Poreim Bo. You need such people. You always need the halakha about Muslim are to be put to death, but who puts them to death? Everyone's going to do that? No. I didn't understand how you mentioned. How did you get Esther involved in this?
No.
You said Esther? And the 6 day what?
No, I'm saying Esther, she did it 3 day Tani.
No, what? Okay. So we see in Sefer Chashmonaim that before they went into battle, they had entire days of fasting and studying Torah before they went into battle. We see that.
No, they were fighting without weapons.
No, with or without, whatever, doesn't matter. But before they went into battle, they declared a fast day, and they had special tefillot, and they read from the Torah. It's mefurash and Sefer Maccabim. That's why I'm saying it's very, very worthwhile and important to read and to see. You see exactly the kind of Seder Yom that is described in Masechet Ta'aniyot for a Yom Ta'anith, where you have a Ta'anith and the Beit Din looks into the ma'asim of the people, and then at the last part of the day they read from the Torah, and they have Chacham Mochiach, and they have tefillah, special tefillah, etc. Exactly that kind of special day and those kinds of events and activities you see described in Sefer Maccabim well before the Mishnah. This is not, in other words, it was not something new. I mean, you already see something similar in Sefer Yoel. In the Navi Yoel talks about describes fast days in the Mikdash and how they used to fast and pray, etc. In other words, the idea of tefillot and ta'aniyot and Torah, be'ef Torah is not a new concept. זה דבר ידוע מפורסם. So we'll stop here. You can, if you want to hold on to the sheets, you're welcome to.
Well, Rosh Chodesh and on Halel it's not SHIUR, it's a SHIUR.
It's a minhag. Halel on Rosh Chodesh is a minhag. That's why you don't recite Halel Shalem on Rosh Chodesh, right?